The soft hum of a television mingled with the clatter of plates as John Johnson stepped into the house, his boots leaving faint trails of dust on the polished wooden floor. The scent of Karen's famous chicken casserole wafted from the kitchen, but something felt off. "Hey, I'm home," John called out, shrugging off his jacket and hanging it on the rack. Karen appeared in the doorway, her auburn hair tied back loosely, and offered him a distracted smile. "Dinner's almost ready. How was work?" "Busy," John said, studying her. Her eyes darted to the side, as if she was expecting someone, or something. "Everything okay?" "Of course," she replied too quickly, retreating to the kitchen. In the dining room, Olivia, their teenage daughter, sat scrolling through her phone, earbuds in place. Ben, the younger of the two, was sprawled on the floor with his action figures. "Dad!" Ben exclaimed, jumping up to greet him. "Guess what? I scored 2 goals at soccer practice today." John ruffled Ben's hair. "That's my boy. Keep it up, and you'll be the star of the team." Karen set the casserole on the table, and the family gathered around. As they ate, John noticed Karen pushing her food around more than eating it. "Something wrong with dinner?" John asked. Karen startled, her fork clinking against the plate. "What? No, it's great. Just tired, that's all." John wasn't convinced, but he let it slide. He had learned over the years that Karen would talk when she was ready, or not at all. After dinner, as John was washing the dishes, a faint, metallic sound caught his attention. He froze, the soapy plate still in his hands, straining to listen. It was faint, like a scrape of metal against concrete, and it seemed to come from outside. "Did you hear that?" he asked Karen, who was drying the table. "Hear what?" she replied, not looking up. "Something outside." Karen shrugged. "Probably Todd tinkering in his garage again. You know how he loves his projects." John frowned. Todd. The neighbor who had moved in 6 months ago and instantly charmed everyone on the block. There was something about him that didn't sit right with John, his easy smiles, the way Karen laughed at his jokes, and those late nights when lights flickered on in Todd's backyard. Later, as John took out the trash, he paused near the fence dividing their yard from Todd's. The strange sound came again, a rhythmic tapping, almost like someone hammering metal. Peering into the neighbor's yard, John saw the glow of a work lamp spilling from Todd's open garage. "Evening, John," came Todd's smooth voice. John flinched as Todd stepped into view, a wrench in hand. He wore his signature grin, the one that made him look like he knew a little too much. "Hey, Todd," John replied, forcing a nod. "Late night project?" "You know me," Todd said with a chuckle, leaning against the fence. "Always tinkering. You should come by sometime, maybe grab a beer and check out my setup." "I'll keep that in mind," John muttered. Todd's grin widened. "You do that. Have a good night, neighbor." As John turned to head back inside, his unease deepened. Something about Todd's words, his tone, felt like a veiled challenge. Inside, Karen was already in bed, her back turned to him. John lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and listening to the faint sounds from Todd's yard, a gnawing feeling growing in his chest. Whatever Todd was doing, John was determined to find out. The soft hum of the house at night was punctuated by the occasional creak of floorboards or the distant rustle of tree branches. John had just drifted off in bed, the weight of the day pulling him into a restless sleep, when the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering glass jolted him awake. He sat up abruptly, heart pounding. "Karen. Did you hear that?" Karen stirred beside him, her face pale in the moonlight. "What was that?" "Stay here," John said, already swinging his legs out of bed. He grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table and padded toward the sound. As he descended the stairs, the chill of the hardwood floor seeped through his socks. His flashlight beam cut through the dark hallway, leading him toward the kitchen. The closer he got, the more the cold night air pricked at his skin. In the kitchen, shards of glass glittered on the tiled floor like scattered diamonds. The window above the sink was a jagged, gaping hole. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint smell of earth and pine. "John." Karen's voice trembled from behind him. She had followed him downstairs, clutching her robe tightly around her. "Stay back," he said, his voice firm. "There's glass everywhere." "What happened?" Karen asked, stepping cautiously closer despite his warning. Her eyes darted between John and the broken window. "I don't know," John replied, peering into the darkness outside. "Doesn't look like anyone's there, but—" "Everything okay?" a familiar voice interrupted, startling them both. They turned to see Todd standing in the doorway, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. His presence felt as sudden and unnerving as the broken window. "I heard the commotion," Todd continued, his tone easy but his eyes sharp. "Thought I'd check in." John straightened, his protective instincts flaring. "We're fine. Thanks." Todd's gaze shifted to the broken glass. "Doesn't look fine. Someone could have thrown something. You want me to take a look around?" "No need," John said, his voice clipped. "I've got it under control." Karen, however, seemed to waver. "Maybe he could help, John. Just to be sure." Todd smiled, a flash of teeth in the dim light. "Always happy to help." John's jaw tightened, his discomfort growing. "I said I've got it." For a moment, Todd's grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of something darker. But it was gone just as quickly as it came. "All right, neighbor. Just let me know if you change your mind." "Night, Karen." As Todd walked away, his silhouette melted into the shadows of his yard, leaving John and Karen in the cold silence of their kitchen. John turned to Karen, who was still staring at the broken window. "You shouldn't have encouraged him," he said quietly. Karen frowned, her expression defensive. "He's just being neighborly." "Neighborly," John muttered under his breath, bending down to pick up the largest pieces of glass. "I don't trust him, Karen. And after tonight, I trust him even less." Karen's response was cut short by a faint metallic sound from outside, the same sound John had heard before. He froze, his ears straining to catch it again. "What is it?" Karen whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," John said, standing slowly. He moved to the window and shone his flashlight into the backyard. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on Todd's garage. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint, flickering light seeped through the crack. "Stay here," John ordered Karen. "John, don't." "I'll be fine," he said, grabbing the heavy flashlight like a makeshift weapon. "Lock the door behind me." Karen hesitated, her worry evident, but she nodded. As John stepped out into the night, the flashlight's beam trembling slightly in his grip, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into something far more sinister than a broken window. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban street as John turned the corner onto his block. His shift had ended early, a rare gift of extra time to spend with his family. He imagined Ben's excitement and Olivia's playful sarcasm when they saw him home early. But as he approached his driveway, the sight of Todd's dark green truck parked in front of his garage made him slow to a crawl. John's stomach twisted. Todd. Again. He killed the engine and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening. His mind raced with explanations. Maybe Todd needed to borrow something. Maybe it was nothing. But the low sound of laughter drifting through the slightly open front window made his heart sink. Karen's laughter. And Todd's. John stepped out of the truck, shutting the door softly. He approached the house, each step heavier than the last. Through the window, he saw the glow of the television and the faint outline of his wife sitting on the couch. Todd's figure was harder to make out, but his voice was unmistakable. I can't believe you did that. Karen's voice floated through the air, light and carefree, a tone John hadn't heard in weeks. And got away with it, Todd replied with a chuckle. It's all about confidence. John's jaw tightened. His breath came in shallow bursts as he stood frozen on the porch. The rational part of his mind told him to walk in casually, to make it clear he'd come home early without causing a scene. But another part, angrier, darker, wanted to fling the door open and demand an explanation. He leaned closer to the window, careful to remain out of sight. Karen leaned forward, her auburn hair catching the sunlight streaming through the curtains. She playfully swatted Todd on the arm, laughing again. Todd leaned back, his posture relaxed, as though he belonged there. John's grip tightened on the edge of the window frame. After a long moment, he stepped away, his boots crunching softly against the gravel path. He circled to the side of the house, where the kitchen door stood slightly ajar. Quietly, he pushed it open, slipping inside. The laughter continued from the living room, oblivious to his presence. John stood in the hallway, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. From his vantage point, he could see the back of the couch and Karen's figure leaning toward Todd, who sat beside her. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to barge in. Instead, he stepped back into the kitchen and grabbed a glass from the cupboard, deliberately clinking it against the counter as he filled it with water. The laughter stopped. John. Karen's voice called out, laced with surprise. Yeah, he replied evenly, walking toward the living room. Shift ended early. When he entered, Karen was sitting upright, a little too quickly, and Todd was leaning forward, his elbows on his knees. Both of them smiled, Karen's a bit too bright, Todd's as smooth as ever. Hey, neighbor, Todd said, his tone easy. Didn't expect to see you this early. Neither did I, John replied, meeting Todd's gaze for a beat too long. He shifted his attention to Karen. What's going on? Karen waved a hand dismissively. Oh, Todd just stopped by to return the hedge trimmer. We were just talking about that time in college when she trailed off, suddenly flustered. John nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Sounds fun. Karen stood abruptly. I was just about to start dinner. Todd, you should stay, you've been such a help lately. John's eyes narrowed. No need. I'm sure Todd has things to do. Todd chuckled, standing as well. Always. Another time, Karen. John followed him to the door, watching as Todd sauntered to his truck. Before climbing in, Todd shot a glance back and smiled. Take care, John. John closed the door firmly and turned to find Karen busying herself in the kitchen, her back to him. The sound of the chopping knife filled the silence. Just stopped by to return the hedge trimmer? John asked, his voice low. Karen didn't turn around. Yeah. I told you, it's nothing. Sure, John said, his tone tight. He didn't push further, but the knot in his chest tightened. Something wasn't right, and he couldn't shake the feeling that Todd wasn't just the friendly neighbor Karen made him out to be. The quiet hum of the dishwasher filled the kitchen as John sat at the table, his elbows resting on the worn wooden surface. Karen moved about the kitchen, tidying up after dinner, her movements brisk but calculated. Karen, John began, his voice calm yet firm, I want to talk about Todd. Her back stiffened for a moment, but she didn't turn to face him. What about him? She asked, her tone light but tinged with unease. John leaned forward, his fingers interlocked. He's been around a lot lately. Stopping by, borrowing tools, chatting. What's going on? Karen let out a soft laugh, finally turning to meet his gaze. What do you mean, what's going on? He's just being neighborly. Neighborly, John repeated, his voice flat. It feels like more than that. Karen frowned, her arms crossing defensively. Don't be ridiculous, John. Todd's just friendly. He likes to tinker, and you know he's not exactly handy. He's borrowed the hedge trimmer, the drill. I think the leaf blower once. And the advice? John asked, his tone sharper now. What kind of advice does he need so often that he's in my living room laughing with you? Karen's cheeks flushed, her eyes narrowing. Why are you interrogating me? You're acting like I've done something wrong. He's our neighbor, for God's sake. John didn't back down, his gaze unwavering. It's not just him, Karen. It's you. The way you laugh when he's around, the way you're always defending him. You've been distant for weeks, and then I come home early and find him in our house, parked in our driveway. Tell me that doesn't look bad. Karen threw the dish towel onto the counter, frustration etched on her face. You're reading into things that aren't there. I've been stressed, John. The kids, the house, everything. Todd's just easy to talk to, okay? He doesn't judge me or make me feel like I'm failing. Failing? John repeated, his voice rising. Who said you're failing? I've done nothing but support you, Karen. But this? This doesn't feel right. Her expression softened for a moment, but then the defensiveness returned. You're being paranoid. Todd's just a friend. Nothing more. John stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Maybe I wouldn't feel paranoid if you were honest with me, Karen. I am being honest, she snapped, her voice trembling. Are you? John shot back, his eyes searching hers for any trace of the woman he had trusted for years. Karen hesitated, her lips parting as if to respond, but then she turned away, grabbing a glass from the cabinet. I don't know what else to say to you, John. If you can't trust me, that's your problem. John stared at her for a long moment, his hands clenched at his sides. The air between them was thick with tension, each word spoken like a thread pulling their relationship taut. Finally, he sighed, his voice quieter. Trust isn't the problem, Karen. It's the lies that are starting to fill the spaces where trust used to be. Karen didn't respond. She stared out the window, the silence stretching between them like an unspoken confession. John turned and walked out of the kitchen, his heart heavy with doubt. He didn't know the truth yet, but he knew one thing for sure, Todd wasn't just a friendly neighbor, and Karen wasn't telling him everything. The tension in the Johnson household lingered like a storm cloud. Days had passed since John's confrontation with Karen, but his suspicions only deepened. It wasn't one big thing, but a series of small, unsettling details that didn't add up. Late one night, as John sat on the couch pretending to read, he heard the faint murmur of Karen's voice coming from upstairs. He rose quietly, the creak of the floorboards swallowed by the muffled sound of her words. No, he doesn't know. I told you, I'll handle it. The voice was low, urgent, but clear enough to send a chill down John's spine. He stopped at the bottom of the staircase, straining to hear more, but then the conversation ended. Karen's footsteps descended the stairs moments later. She froze when she saw him. Couldn't sleep, she asked, her tone casual, but her eyes betrayed her unease. Phone call? John asked, tilting his head. Just Lisa, Karen replied quickly. She's dealing with some drama again. John nodded, feigning belief. But something gnawed at him. Karen always avoided late-night calls, claiming they disturbed the kids. The following day, as John was leaving for work, Olivia stopped him at the door. Hey, Dad, she said, her brow furrowed. Is Mr. Todd helping you with something? John turned to her, his stomach tightening. Why do you ask? I saw him here yesterday, Olivia said, twirling a strand of hair absently. I thought you were home, but when I called for you, Mom said you weren't. John forced a calm smile. What was he doing? Just standing in the driveway. He and Mom were talking, but when I came out, he left really fast. It was kinda weird. John's chest tightened, but he kept his tone light. Thanks for telling me, sweetheart. Don't worry about it. That evening, after everyone had gone to bed, John went to the garage. Something had been bothering him about Todd's recent visits, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there were clues hiding in plain sight. The garage smelled faintly of motor oil and sawdust. John scanned the workbench and shelves, his eyes darting over the familiar tools and supplies. Then he spotted it, something out of place. A sleek, black thermos, gleaming in the dim light. John picked it up, turning it over in his hands. It was heavy, expensive-looking, and definitely not his. The initials, T.W., were etched on the side. Todd Walsh. His pulse quickened. What was Todd's thermos doing here? John placed the thermos back on the bench, exactly where he found it. He didn't want Karen to know he'd been looking. As he left the garage, his mind raced. There was no denying it now, something was happening between Karen and Todd. The signs were everywhere, the late-night calls, Olivia's observation, and now this. John returned to the house, his jaw tight with determination. He couldn't ignore the truth any longer. Whatever Karen was hiding, it was time to uncover it. The moment of truth came unexpectedly. John had been sifting through the cluttered drawers in the kitchen, looking for a tape measure, when he found it, a small envelope tucked beneath a pile of loose receipts. It wasn't addressed to him. The envelope contained a handwritten note, the unmistakable scrawl reading, "Can't stop thinking about you. Last night was everything. T.W." John's breath caught in his throat. The room spun as he gripped the note tightly, the edges crumpling in his calloused hands. This wasn't a misunderstanding, or a series of innocent coincidences. This was proof. Karen walked into the kitchen, carrying a laundry basket. She froze when she saw the envelope in his hand, her face draining of color. "What's this?" John demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Karen hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for words that wouldn't come. "It's not what you think," she began weakly. "Not what I think." John slammed the note onto the counter, the sound sharp in the tense air. "This is from Todd, isn't it? Last night was everything." "What exactly does that mean, Karen?" Karen set the laundry basket down and stepped toward him, her hands trembling. "John, please, let me explain." "Explain." John's voice rose, filled with anger and hurt. "You've been lying to me for weeks, sneaking around, taking his calls, and now I find this. What's left to explain, Karen?" Tears welled in Karen's eyes, but John didn't let up. "You had him in our house, Karen. Our kids are here. How could you do this?" Karen's voice cracked as she replied, "It's not like that. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" John pressed, his voice trembling. "Tell me the truth, Karen. All of it." Karen sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "I didn't sleep with him," she whispered, her voice muffled. "But I wanted to. I thought about it. She choked back a sob. "I needed to feel something, John. Something different. He made me feel noticed, alive, and I got carried away." John stared at her, the weight of her words crashing over him like a wave. "Carried away," he said bitterly. "You've wrecked our marriage because you wanted to feel noticed. Did you think about me? About our kids? Or were you too busy sneaking around with Todd to care?" Karen's tears flowed freely now. "I know I messed up, but it wasn't like that. I didn't think it would go this far." John turned away, running a hand through his hair, his frustration boiling over. "And the broken window? That wasn't a coincidence, was it?" Karen hesitated, and that hesitation was answer enough. "Todd was here that night," John said, the realization hitting him like a punch to the gut. "Something happened, and you tried to cover it up. Didn't you?" Karen nodded, her voice barely audible. He came over after you went to bed. He said he needed to talk, and I didn't know how to say no." The window broke when he tripped over something in the dark. John let out a bitter laugh, pacing the room. Unbelievable. You let him into our home, Karen. You let him get close to you, to us, and for what? A thrill? I didn't mean for it to go this far, Karen pleaded. I love you, John. I do. John stopped pacing and stared at her, his expression hollow. Love? This isn't love, Karen. This is betrayal. Karen reached for him, but he stepped back. Don't, he said, his voice cold. Don't touch me. The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in their marriage, Karen realized she might have crossed a line that couldn't be repaired. I'm taking the kids to my mom's tomorrow, John said finally, his tone resolute. You need to figure out what you want, Karen, because this? He gestured between them. This is broken. Karen's sobs filled the kitchen as John walked out, the sound of her heartbreak echoing in his ears. But he didn't look back. He couldn't. The house was quiet, but not the peaceful quiet John had grown used to. This silence was heavy, like the aftermath of a storm. The kids were at his mom's, Karen had retreated to their bedroom, and John sat alone in the dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey. The broken window across the room caught the light from the street lamp outside, its jagged edges a stark reminder of everything that had unraveled in the past weeks. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his mind racing. The anger still burned, but beneath it was an ache he couldn't ignore. Karen's betrayal had shattered something fundamental, trust. Yet, as much as he wanted to hate her, he couldn't erase the 10 years they had spent building a life together, the laughter, the love, the children they had brought into the world. He closed his eyes, and the memories washed over him. Olivia's first steps. Ben's triumphant grin after scoring his first soccer goal. Karen's smile on their wedding day, radiant and full of promise. And now this. The next morning, after a night of restless sleep, John stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window. The faint sound of children playing drifted through the air, a cruel contrast to the chaos in his heart. Karen entered quietly, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching a cup of coffee like a lifeline. John, she began softly. Can we talk? He turned to her, his expression guarded. About what? Karen stepped closer, her voice trembling. About us. About everything. John sighed, setting his mug down. I've thought about it, Karen. I don't know if I can forgive you. What you did, it wasn't just about you and Todd. It was about us. Our family. And you broke that. Tears welled in her eyes. I know I did, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I need you to understand, I was lost. I felt invisible, like I was just going through the motions every day. Todd gave me attention, and I let it cloud my judgment. I made a mistake, John. A terrible one. But I love you. I want to fix this, if you'll let me. John's jaw tightened. Love isn't just words, Karen. It's actions. And yours, he trailed off, shaking his head. I don't know if I can trust you again. Karen wiped her tears, nodding. I understand. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, anything. Please, John. Don't throw everything we've built away because of my mistake. Later that day, John drove to Todd's house. He needed answers, or maybe just closure. Standing on the front porch, he clenched his fists, his pulse pounding in his ears. Todd opened the door, his smug smile vanishing when he saw John's expression. John, Todd said, his tone cautious. Didn't expect to see you here. John stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Stay away from my family. If I see you near my wife or my kids again, we're going to have a serious problem. Todd held up his hands. Hey, I get it. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. It's over, okay? It was never supposed to start, John growled. He turned and walked away, leaving Todd standing in the doorway. That evening, John stood by the broken window, the cool night air brushing against his face. He held the shards of glass in his hand, each piece a fragment of a life he wasn't sure he could piece back together. Behind him, Karen appeared silently, her presence tentative. She didn't say anything, just stood there, watching him. I don't know what the future holds, John said finally, his voice soft. But I do know one thing, I need time. For me. For the kids. For us, if there's even an us left to save. Karen nodded, tears streaming silently down her face. Take all the time you need. I'll wait, John. For as long as it takes. He set the glass down and looked at her, a flicker of the man he once was reflected in his eyes. Turning back to the window, he stared out into the night, the sound of the wind filling the void between them. The broken window was still there, jagged and raw, but it was also a reminder, sometimes, what's shattered can be replaced, if you have the strength to rebuild. The end.